on July 7, 1944, broke over the island of Saipan with an unsettling quiet. For more than 3 weeks, the air had been constantly filled with the deafening cacophony of war, the crump of mortar shells, the relentless crack of rifle fire, and the screams of the wounded. But now, a heavy, unnatural silence descended upon the American lines. For the battle-hardened Marines and soldiers of the 27th Infantry Division, this silence was not a relief. It was a portent. It was the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath, a vacuum that the laws of war demanded must be filled. Veterans who had survived the hellish landings on the beaches and the brutal fights for ridges and caves knew this feeling all too well. It was the calm before the storm. They checked their ammunition, tightened their grips on their rifles, and peered into the dim, tangled landscape before them, their senses screaming that something was coming. But nothing could truly prepare them for what was about to be unleashed. They were poised on the edge of a violent, history-altering event, completely unaware that they were the target of the largest and most desperate Banzai charge the Pacific Theater would ever witness. 1:30 to 4 o'clock. Introduction. Why Saipan mattered. To grasp the sheer raw desperation that would drive thousands of men to a suicidal charge, one must first understand the immense strategic value of this small island. By the summer of 1944, the American island hopping campaign was carving a path directly toward the Japanese homeland. The Mariana Islands, and Saipan in particular, were not just another objective. They were the linchpin. For the United States, capturing Saipan meant gaining airfields from which the revolutionary new B-29 Superfortress bombers could operate. These long-range behemoths could finally bring the war home to Japan's cities, factories, and civilians, a psychological and military blow from which the empire might not recover. For Imperial Japan, the stakes were equally existential. Saipan was a cornerstone of their absolute national defense sphere, the final defensive barrier protecting the home islands. Its fall would shatter this perimeter, leaving Japan vulnerable and cutting off crucial supply lines from the south. The High Command in Tokyo understood this completely, and their orders to the defenders were unambiguous and grim. Hold Saipan at all costs. The fate of the empire, they believed, truly rested on the outcome of this one brutal battle. The American force designated for the invasion of Saipan, designated Operation Forager, was a testament to the industrial and military might the United States had marshaled by 1944. The V Amphibious Corps, under the command of Lieutenant General Holland Howland Mad Smith, comprised the battle-hardened 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, with the Army's 27th Infantry Division in reserve. The 2nd Marines had already seen the hell of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, while the 4th had been blooded in the Marshall Islands. They were not green troops. They were veterans of amphibious assaults who understood the grim calculus of landing on a hostile beach. Their equipment and support were overwhelming. A vast armada of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, surrounded the island. This floating fortress included fast battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers capable of delivering devastating naval gunfire, as well as a fleet of aircraft carriers whose planes had already begun a systematic campaign to soften up Japanese defenses. The American objective was clear and strategic: to secure the island, neutralize all resistance, and capture the critical airfields at Aslido and the open ground suitable for runways for the B-29s. Their doctrine emphasized combined arms, the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, naval gunfire, and air power to methodically dismantle enemy positions while preserving American lives wherever possible. They came not just to attack, but to occupy and transform the island into a permanent spearhead aimed at the heart of Japan. Facing this juggernaut was the Japanese 43rd Division, under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, bolstered by the Imperial Japanese Navy's ground forces and other attached units, bringing their total strength to approximately 31,000 men. Saito, a cavalry officer, was a respected but not particularly distinguished commander, and he was facing an unprecedented challenge. His force was a heterogeneous mix, including the Corps Army Division, thousands of naval troops under Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the erstwhile commander of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, now relegated to a land-based command, and even labor battalions. This patchwork command structure would later cause significant issues in coordination. Unlike the American force that arrived with the tide, the Japanese defenders had been on Saipan for some time, and they had used it well. They had transformed the island's natural topography into a formidable defensive network. The lush, rugged landscape was honeycombed with caves, many of them natural limestone formations that were artificially enlarged and reinforced. They constructed intricate bunker systems, machine gun nests cleverly concealed in the rocky cliffs and dense vegetation, and extensive trench lines. The strategy, born from the bitter lessons of earlier island battles, was to avoid contesting the beaches at all costs. Instead, they would allow the Americans to land and then bleed them white from these deeply echeloned, mutually supporting defensive positions inland. However, beneath this formidable defensive facade, the Japanese situation was dire and growing more desperate by the day. From the outset, they were critically short of the essential tools of war. Their artillery was limited in both quantity and ammunition, and the relentless American naval and air bombardment systematically destroyed many of their precious guns before they could even be fully utilized. Logistics were a nightmare. Supply lines from Japan had been severed by American submarines, leading to severe shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. The soldiers were already on reduced rations before the first American landing craft even hit the beach. Morale, while initially high, was brittle. The Japanese soldier was indoctrinated with an unshakable belief in his spiritual superiority and the divine nature of his cause, but he was not immune to the crushing reality of American material dominance. He watched as American planes controlled the skies and American ships dominated the sea, turning his fortified island into a prison. The hope of a decisive naval battle that would destroy the American invasion fleet, a cornerstone of Japanese strategy, was utterly shattered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, which occurred just days after the landings. With the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air power decimated and in retreat, the garrison on Saipan was completely isolated, left to fight and die with no prospect of reinforcement or rescue. They were low on supplies, ammunition, and, increasingly, any tangible hope of victory. They were left with only one resource in abundance: a fanatical determination to die for the emperor. The American landing on June 15, 1944, did not merely begin a battle. It ignited a 3-week-long descent into a special kind of hell. The initial waves of Marines, emerging from their landing craft into a storm of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire, quickly discovered that the Japanese strategy was not to stop them at the water's edge, but to bury them in a slow, grinding war of attrition inland. The fight swiftly moved from the sandy beaches into a nightmarish landscape of tangled sugarcane fields, rugged ridges, and labyrinthine cave systems. Every advance was measured in yards and paid for in blood. Key terrain features earned their grim nicknames from the men who fought and died there. Hell's Pocket was a low, swampy area surrounded by hills, a natural kill zone where Japanese defenders pinned down American units, inflicting heavy casualties from concealed positions. Suicide Ridge and Purple Heart Ridge were formidable escarpments where the Japanese had dug in with a network of bunkers, spider holes, and artillery observers who could direct devastating fire on any approach. The fighting was intimate and brutal. It was a war of grenades tossed into cave mouths, of flamethrowers searing dark holes with jellied fire, and of bayonets in the close confines of a trench. Progress was agonizingly slow, as each cave, each pillbox, each sniper's nest had to be identified and neutralized individually, a deadly and exhausting process that wore down both body and spirit. For the Japanese defenders, the relentless American pressure was a vice slowly squeezing the life out of their defense. By July 6th, their position had become untenable. The remaining forces, a battered and disorganized mix of army and naval units, were compressed into the northern tip of the island around Mount Tapachau and the cliffs of Marpi Point. Their command structure, which had always been somewhat fragmented, was now in a state of near-total collapse. Communication between isolated pockets of resistance was sporadic at best. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, the nominal commander of the island's defense, was himself a symbol of this disintegration. Wounded during the American advance, He was weak and unable to effectively direct his dwindling forces. The final crushing blow to Japanese morale had come weeks earlier, though its effects were now fully realized. The Imperial Japanese Navy, their last hope for relief or reinforcement, had been decisively defeated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The news of this catastrophic failure, the loss of hundreds of aircraft and 3 carriers, filtered through the ranks, extinguishing the last flicker of hope for rescue. They were utterly and completely alone. The American noose was tight, their supplies of food, water, and ammunition were almost exhausted, and the constant thunder of American artillery and the omnipresent hum of American aircraft were a ceaseless reminder of their enemy's overwhelming material superiority. The concept of victory had long since evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of certain defeat and death. It was within this cauldron of despair, on the precipice of annihilation, that the final act of the tragedy was conceived. The Japanese High Command, with Saito and Admiral Nagumo at its crumbling center, faced a choice that was no choice at all. Surrender was unthinkable, a dishonor worse than death according to the Bushido code that governed their military ethos. A slow, piecemeal destruction by American flamethrowers and artillery was seen as a passive and ignoble end. There remained only one path that offered a semblance of purpose and honor in their defeat: a final, all-out, suicidal attack. This would not be a tactical counteroffensive aimed at achieving a military objective. Its goal was far more profound and far more desperate. It was to be a gyokusai, a word translating to shattered jewel, signifying an honorable self-destruction in the face of impossible odds. The plan was simple in its horrifying totality. Every remaining soldier, sailor, and able-bodied man would be assembled. They would arm themselves with whatever was left: rifles with the last few rounds, bayonets, swords, knives, and even sharpened bamboo poles. In one massive, concentrated wave, they would crash upon the American lines. Their orders were not to break through for escape, but to infiltrate, to kill as many of the enemy as possible before being killed themselves, to die gloriously for the Emperor, and in doing so, shatter themselves against the American war machine like a precious jewel upon stone. The stage was set for an eruption of violence on a scale the Pacific War had never seen. The command post, a cramped and stifling cave in the diminishing pocket of Japanese control, was a physical manifestation of the despair that had taken hold. Here, amidst the smell of damp earth and unburied dead, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the man who had once led the carrier force at Pearl Harbor but was now a land-bound commander without a fleet, faced the final, undeniable truth. The reports from the collapsing front lines were unanimous. Organized resistance was no longer possible. The options before them had narrowed to a single, grim conclusion. To surrender was a permanent stain on their honor and their families, an act forbidden by the very soul of the warrior code they lived by. To wait passively for the inevitable American assault was a slow, inglorious end, picked apart in a dark hole. There was, they concluded, only one path that preserved their dignity and served the Emperor one final time. They would transform their certain defeat into a weapon. They would launch a gyokusai, a final mass suicide attack, to shatter themselves against the enemy in one glorious, catastrophic blow. The plan, conceived in desperation, was chilling in its simplicity and its absolute rejection of survival. On the night of July 6th, orders were dispatched to every remaining pocket of troops. All able-bodied men were to assemble for the attack. This call to arms transcended all conventional military structure. It was not just for the frontline infantry, but for everyone: cooks, clerks, mechanics, and bandmen. Even the wounded were included. Any man who could stand and hold a weapon, even if it was only a sharpened stick, was expected to join. This final muster gathered between 3,000 and 4,000 men, a haunting assembly of what remained of the garrison. Their armament was a testament to their dire state. A lucky few shouldered rifles with their last handful of rounds. Others fixed bayonets to empty rifles, or clutched swords, officers' katana alongside crude utility machetes. Many, however, were armed only with knives, or with bamboo spears they had sharpened themselves. They were not an army, but a torrent of doomed humanity preparing for a final furious release. The objective was not to win the battle, nor was it to escape. The goal was purely to kill and to die with honor. The plan was to mass this force and, just before dawn, hurl it directly at the center of the American lines, which were held by the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division. They were to smash through the forward positions, ignoring flank security and their own catastrophic losses. Their target was not the frontline riflemen, but what lay beyond: the American command posts, the artillery batteries, and the logistical support areas. If they could overrun the gun lines and slaughter the crews, they could inflict a profound and shocking blow, turning American guns silent with their own bodies. The attack was to be a dagger thrust into the heart of the American position, a final defiant act of destruction. With the orders given and the fate of his command sealed, General Saito performed his final duty as a samurai. In the early morning hours of July 7th, he assembled his staff, thanked them for their service, and declared, "I will advance to seek the enemy. I will leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific." He then retired to a secluded spot, performed the ritual of seppuku, and was beheaded by his aide to end his agony. Admiral Nagumo, sharing the same fate, is believed to have taken his own life by a pistol shot, a less ceremonial but equally final end. Their suicides were the ultimate signal that there was no turning back, that the final desperate plan was now in motion. The command had fallen apart, leaving the thousands of assembled men as a leaderless, vengeful spirit, poised to unleash itself upon the unsuspecting Americans in the largest and most organized suicide charge of the Pacific War. The pre-dawn stillness of July 7th was not merely quiet. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all sound. For the soldiers of the 27th Infantry Division, particularly the 105th Infantry Regiment holding a stretched thin line across the island's northern plain, the tension was palpable. Then, at approximately 4:30 a.m., the silence was shattered not by a single shot, but by a rising, cacophonous roar. From the darkness ahead emerged a sight that seemed to defy modern warfare: a massive, screaming wave of humanity. It was not a disciplined military advance but a frantic, surging tide of soldiers and sailors, their faces contorted, voices screaming Banzai and Tenno Haika Banzai. Long live the Emperor! They came not in skirmish lines but in a dense, seemingly endless column, a phalanx of desperation dozens wide and hundreds deep. Their intent was immediately clear to the stunned American defenders. This was not an attack to gain ground, but a suicidal rush designed to overwhelm and kill as many Americans as possible in a final apocalyptic orgy of violence before they themselves were cut down. The initial impact was catastrophic for the American frontline units. The weight and ferocity of the human tsunami simply overwhelmed outposts and forward positions. Japanese soldiers, many armed only with bayonets or swords, poured over foxholes, engaging in frantic close-quarters combat. The fighting descended into a primal struggle. Men used rifles as clubs, stabbed with bayonets, and swung entrenching tools like axes. Fists and teeth became weapons in the murky half-light. The chaos was absolute, with friend and foe entangled in a desperate melee. The American line, strained to its breaking point, began to buckle and in places, disintegrate entirely. The Japanese flood, fueled by a collective death wish, pushed forward, bypassing strong points and infiltrating through gaps, their target not the frontline soldier, but the softer support elements to the rear. As the scale of the assault became terrifyingly clear, the American response escalated with brutal force. Understanding that the entire regimental position was in peril, artillery forward observers called for fire directly on their own coordinates. The sky tore open as batteries of 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers began firing danger close, their high-explosive shells walking a wall of shrapnel and earth through the oncoming enemy ranks. On the ground, machine gun crews became the anchors of the defense. Teams from the 105th and supporting battalions set up their water-cooled M1917 Brownings and air-cooled M1919s, firing into the onrushing mass at point-blank range. The scene was one of horrific industrial slaughter. Gunners traversed their weapons back and forth, scything down waves of attackers. The barrels of their machine guns grew red-hot, steaming and smoking until they seized up, unable to fire. In a desperate attempt to keep firing, crews urinated on the glowing metal to cool them down, the acrid smell mixing with the cordite and blood. The ground before the American positions became a grotesque carpet of the dead and dying, but still more came, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades without breaking stride. The focal point of the carnage became the positions held by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment. Here, the Japanese charge achieved its deepest and most devastating penetration. The two battalions were effectively surrounded and cut off, their command posts overrun. What followed was a massacre. Isolated companies were swarmed. In one of the war's most harrowing episodes, elements of the 1st Battalion were forced into a last stand on a small hill, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted and they were killed almost to the man. The fighting was not a battle but a slaughter at arm's length. Medics attempting to tend to the wounded were specifically targeted and killed. Soldiers trapped in their foxholes fought until they were overrun. The casualty figures for the 105th were staggering, representing some of the highest single-day losses for an American regiment in the entire Pacific theater. As the morning sun rose, illuminating a landscape of almost unimaginable horror, the nature of the fighting began to change. The great coordinated wave had spent its force, its energy dissipating against the hardened American artillery and the final desperate stands of the infantry. What remained was no longer a charge, but a bloody and grueling mop-up operation that would last for hours. Small, isolated groups of Japanese soldiers, now leaderless and with no hope of further progress, holed up in captured foxholes, trenches, and shell craters. They had to be rooted out one by one. This phase was in many ways just as dangerous as the initial assault, a close-range lethal game of clearing positions with grenades, flamethrowers, and point-blank rifle fire. The Americans, enraged by the carnage inflicted on their comrades and hardened by the surreal violence of the dawn, showed little quarter. The field, littered with thousands of Japanese bodies and the wreckage of two shattered American battalions, fell into an uneasy and grisly silence, broken only by the sporadic crack of a rifle shot finishing the last of the charge. The largest Banzai attack of the Pacific War had reached its bloody and inevitable conclusion. The dawn of July 8th revealed a scene of almost biblical devastation. As the smoke from the final desperate skirmishes cleared, the full horrifying cost of the night's violence lay exposed under the harsh Pacific sun. The landscape, once marked by grassy fields and stands of trees, was now a grotesque tapestry of the dead. The bodies of Japanese soldiers lay in windrows, piled several deep in places where American machine guns and artillery had done their gruesome work. In some sectors, the sheer volume of corpses made it impossible to walk without stepping on the fallen. The final count would stagger the combatants on both sides. Over 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead in and around the American positions, a testament to the sheer scale and ferocity of the charge. But the price of stopping this human tsunami had been exorbitant. American losses were equally staggering, with nearly 1,000 men from the 105th Infantry Regiment and supporting units killed or wounded in just those few hours of close-quarters combat. The two battalions of the 105th had been effectively annihilated as fighting units, suffering a casualty rate that ranked among the very worst for American forces in a single engagement during the entire Pacific War. The field was not just a military victory. It was a charnel house, a silent, stinking monument to the ultimate expression of a desperate, fanatical will. In a purely tactical sense, the grand charge had been a catastrophic failure for the Japanese. It had not broken the American line in a strategic sense, nor had it captured any significant artillery or command posts for more than a few fleeting moments. The attack had achieved its deepest penetrations only at the cost of the complete self-immolation of the last organized fighting force on the island. Yet, to dismiss it as merely a failure would be to misunderstand its profound psychological impact. For the American soldiers who witnessed and survived it, the event was a deeply traumatic shock that would haunt them for decades. They had not just fought an enemy, they had faced a force that rejected the very instinct for survival, an army that had willingly transformed itself into a weapon of mass suicide. The charge cemented in the American mind a terrifying understanding of the Japanese soldier's mindset. Surrender was not an option, and death in battle was the ultimate goal. This realization would cast a long shadow over the remaining operations in the Pacific, convincing American planners that the invasion of the Japanese home islands would demand a blood price of almost unimaginable scale. With the shattering of this final concentrated force, organized resistance on Saipan effectively ceased. The Gyokusai had been the death rattle of the Japanese garrison. The remaining scattered soldiers, leaderless and devoid of any coherent plan, could offer only token isolated resistance in the following days. The task for the Americans shifted from pitched battle to the dangerous grinding work of mopping up holdouts in caves and ravines. Just 2 days later, on July 9, 1944, the island was officially declared secure by American command. The battle for Saipan was over. The cost had been immense. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison of 30,000 was wiped out, while American forces suffered over 13,000 casualties, including more than 3,000 killed. The capture of the island provided the United States with the airfields it so desperately needed, and from them, the B-29 superfortresses would soon begin their devastating firebombing campaigns against the cities of Japan, bringing the war to the enemy's homeland with a terrifying new intensity. The Banzai charge, in its failure, had not only ended the battle for Saipan but had also dramatically accelerated the downward spiral of the war for Japan, proving that even the most supreme sacrifice could not stop the relentless advance of American military power. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves through the Japanese Empire, the repercussions of which were both immediate and profound. The loss of this critical pillar in the absolute national defense sphere was an unmitigated military and political catastrophe. The news, when it finally broke through the veil of censorship in Tokyo, shattered the illusion of eventual victory that the government had carefully cultivated. The public could no longer ignore the reality that American bombers were now within striking distance of the home islands. The political fallout was swift and severe. The government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had personally assured the public that Saipan was impregnable, collapsed in disgrace. His resignation marked a critical turning point, signaling the beginning of the end for the militaristic faction that had led Japan into war and the start of a slow, secretive move among some leaders to seek a way to end the conflict, even as public rhetoric remained fiercely defiant. For the United States, the capture of Saipan was a strategic triumph of incalculable value. The island's airfields were swiftly transformed into the most important forward base of the entire Pacific theater. From the runways of Isley Field, the enormous Boeing B-29 superfortresses began their long-range missions, first with high-altitude precision bombing and later with the devastating low-level firebombing raids that would incinerate vast sections of Japan's urban centers, including Tokyo. The war was now being brought directly to the Japanese people with a destructive fury they had never imagined possible. Saipan became more than an airbase. It was a tangible symbol of America's reach and power, a stationary aircraft carrier from which the final assault on Japan was launched. Yet, the battle left behind a legacy far more complex and darker than a simple strategic victory. The fanatical resistance of the soldiers, culminating in the apocalyptic Banzai charge, was tragically mirrored by the fate of thousands of Japanese civilians on the island. Subjected to years of relentless propaganda depicting American soldiers as monstrous barbarians who would torture, rape, and murder them, hundreds of families chose death over capture. In the final days of the battle, at places like Marpy Point, they committed mass suicide, leaping from the high cliffs into the sea below or killing themselves with grenades handed to them by soldiers. These horrific scenes, captured by American photographers, served as a grim testament to the power of indoctrination and the human cost of a war fought without quarter. The largest Banzai charge was, therefore, not an isolated event but a terrifying preview. It demonstrated to Allied planners and infantrymen alike that the Japanese military and, tragically, much of the civilian population would rather embrace self-destruction than surrender. This grim calculus, forged in the carnage of Saipan, would hang over every subsequent operation, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and would profoundly influence the final, fateful decision to use atomic weapons to bring the war to a close.